once upon a time, and our ears perk up because those are the opening words to a story. We love a story because, in some unfathomable way, it helps us to understand life. My name's David Woodall with the United Church of Canada and the Emsdale Pastoral Charge. Jesus primarily shared stories with anyone who would listen. He didn't necessarily interpret the stories, he left that to his hearers to do. I heard this story years ago during a time of division and anger with others. And it seems to me it's a good story to hear again, with all that's going on in this world, and particularly at Thanksgiving. Once upon a time, there was an island in the middle of the ocean. It was divided by high walls into 7 kingdoms, each like a piece of pie. Indeed, if you could have looked at the island from a helicopter, it would have looked like a giant pizza cut into 7 pieces. It was a beautiful island, and it would have been a perfect place to live except for 2 things. Those high walls meant that the people in one realm did not know the people in another realm. And there was no fresh water on the island. Oh, there was plenty of water in the sea, but it was salt water which no one could drink. This meant that the islanders had to catch every drop of water that fell. And because it was never enough, they had to depend on ships to bring in fresh water. In each of the kingdoms, there were storytellers, whose stories often began with the words, "Once there was a river." And the stories would tell about a river which had disappeared. One who was fascinated by these stories was a young boy named Richard, who decided that he would try to find a lost river. He talked to all the wise elderly people, but none of them could remember where the river had been. It had disappeared so many years ago. Maybe, thought Richard, it's in one of the other kingdoms. He went to the queen of his country and asked permission to visit the other parts of the island. At first the queen refused. "Don't you know," she said, "that the people in those other kingdoms are our enemies? Your life would be in danger." "But surely," said Richard, "no one would harm a little boy." Finally the queen agreed, and Richard, using a rowboat, traveled from kingdom to kingdom, asking questions about the missing water. And everywhere he went, he heard the same story. Oh yes, there was a river, but it's gone now. To his surprise, Richard found that the people in the other countries were just like his own people. Was this what enemies looked like? When he returned to his own country, he told his story to the queen, and then he went to visit the wisest man in the country. After listening to Richard's story, the wise man said, "I think you're ready to read the great book." He took Richard into a room that was completely empty except for a table on which rested a huge book. "You may read 1 page each day for 7 days," said the wise person, "and then come to see me again." Richard opened the book at the first page and read, "What 1 cannot do, 2 can do." On the second page, on the second day, he read, "What 2 cannot, 3 can do." On the third day, the message was, "What 3 cannot, 4 can do." On the fourth day, he read, "What 4 cannot, 5 can do." On the fifth, "What 5 cannot, 6 can do." And it did not surprise him at all on the 6th day to read, "What 6 cannot, 7 can do." But he wondered what would be there on the 7th day. On the last page was written, "One for all, and all for each." Richard hurried to the wise man, who asked him, "Did you understand what you read?" "I think so," said Richard. "I think it means that all of the kingdoms must work together to find the water." The wise man only smiled and then went back to sleep. Richard went to the queen with a plan. Once again, the queen at first refused to listen. But then she remembered that there had been no rain for a long time, and the boats had hardly come to the island. Surely it would not hurt to try. The queen sent a message to all the other rulers, asking them to gather on a certain day at the center of the island. They were all very suspicious, but because they needed water so much, they all came, with their armies and their people for protection. Richard stood on the wall at the point where all the walls met, and said, "We must break down the wall at this point to find the water." The people at first shouted and refused, but some did climb up on the wall to look at their enemies, and they saw people just like themselves. Richard took a stone from the top of the wall and passed it down to a friend who carried it to a safe place. And then his queen climbed the wall and removed a stone. It looked like so much fun that to the children that they didn't wait any longer, and soon the center of the wall was covered with people and children carrying away the stones. And when they came to level ground, Richard said, "Now stand back. There's only one stone left." As he lifted it, water began to trickle out, and then a small fountain of water, and finally a giant spray which soaked the people in every kingdom. The children danced in the spray. The women filled buckets. The men stood in wonder. And what they noticed was that when the water fell to the ground, it disappeared again. "Now," said Richard, "we must tear down all the walls to see where the water goes." And before anyone could protest, the children were there leading the way. When all the walls were down, to their surprise, the people saw 7 rivers running from the spring out to the ocean in the very place that the walls had been. "How did you know?" they asked Richard. And he replied, "I didn't know for sure, but if all the kingdoms knew about rivers of water, the source of it had to be in the center. I think what happened was this. Once everyone shared the springs and the rivers, but then quarrels broke out, and people wanted all the water for themselves, so they built walls along the river banks, first on one side and then on the other, and they began to fight about the water, and stones were thrown and more stones until the space between the walls filled up with stones. Eventually the rivers disappeared, and the stones blocked the spring itself. The people looked at each other and said, "We must make sure this never happens again." So they built bridges instead of walls, and the children ran back and forth and played together, and families became friends. As for Richard, he grew older and wiser, and one day became the keeper of the great book. He always left it open for anyone to read that last page, one for all and all for each. And when he told stories to the children, he would always begin, "Now there is a river, but once upon a time." And Richard's story had a happy ending. How do we say thank you to God on this Thanksgiving in a real way? We build bridges instead of walls. This is even in our own family. We nurture friends instead of despising enemies. We come and worship, and then we go from here and live as God's people, nurturing the gifts of the rivers that flow, building bridges, living love, caring, and sharing out of the richness of our lives. And I like the idea of sharing what we have. One of the great human struggles that all of us face is that who we really are becomes lost in the abundance that cascades over us. And this abundance entices our living, and too soon we grow possessive and suspicious. We think only of our own welfare. We throw stones and the rivers are blocked, and we grow thirsty and fearful. These ancient words are found in the Bible. "For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with flowing streams, with springs and underground waters welling up in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat bread without scarcity, where you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and from whose hills you may mine copper. You shall eat your fill, and bless the Lord your God for the good land that he has given you. And do not forget the Lord your God. Happy Thanksgiving.